haunted houses, haunted hospitals,
haunted lighthouses.
Turns out there's a lot.
Lost lovers, violent crimes, and even ancient burial grounds. We've got it all for you today, so sit back, relax, and
enjoy the show.
Light it up.
Gibraltar Point Lighthouse is the oldest existing lighthouse on the Great Lakes. It's also said to be one of the most haunted buildings in Toronto. It was built in 1808 on the Toronto Islands and is said to be haunted till this day by its first keeper, John Paul Rademüller, who was killed in 1815. Now there are a few different versions of this story about how he died, but the most common is that he was killed by two soldiers from Fort York. You see, Rademüller was a bootlegger of beer, and after learning of how watered down his booze was, a scuffle broke out with Rademüller being beaten to death by the soldiers. His ghost is said to haunt the lighthouse to this day. I actually went to elementary school on the island and have seen the place up close a number of times. I even had a teacher who'd been inside it alone one day, and this guy was not a big believer in paranormal type stuff. He was this very no-nonsense like British man, but he told this story where as he was climbing the lighthouse steps, he started to hear labored breaths coming from below. He figured a guard had come in or something like that, and he started climbing back down the steps to check it out, see what was up, but nobody there. He was completely alone the whole time.
Next on our list today we have St. Mary's Lighthouse, located on St. Mary's Island in Whitley Bay, England. Prior to the construction of the lighthouse, a medieval chapel had been built on the island, and next to the chapel was a burial ground for the island's monks. In 1898, when the lighthouse was built, the remains of the chapel vanished, and as cottages were built up around the island to accommodate the various lighthouse keepers, the graves of the monks actually became disturbed as construction workers broke ground in the areas surrounding the lighthouse. While this is already grounds for, well, haunted grounds, prior to the construction of the lighthouse, a few other less peaceful deaths occurred on the island. In 1722, Anthony Mitchell, a local customs officer, was brutalized and killed by smugglers who dumped his body on the island. And in 1739, a glassmaker, Michael Curry, was sentenced to death at the gallows on the island after killing a man by the name of Old Hartley. Needless to say, if you are looking to spend some time in a haunted lighthouse, Mary's Island is the place to go. You can even visit the lighthouse, but be warned, as the tours on the island reserved for the living are said to often be accompanied by the dead.
The Seguin Island Lighthouse in Maine was built in 1857. It's said to be haunted by the spirit of a husband and wife. Now the story goes that one of the early keepers lived alone at the lighthouse with his wife. They were both isolated and lonely. For long periods, they barely interacted with the outside world. The wife spent a lot of time playing piano to pass the hours, and as the months wore on, the husband began losing his mind, and eventually he just snapped, bludgeoning his wife with an axe before taking his own life. And some nights it's said you can hear faint piano melodies coming from the lighthouse, where there's no longer a piano. One of the creepiest stories happened in 1985. The lighthouse had been decommissioned, and a warrant officer was tasked with spending the night in the lighthouse to make sure that everything of value was going to be packed to be loaded onto a boat the next day. That night, the officer woke up to his bed shaking and an eerie voice screaming at him to leave. Now the officer figured he'd maybe just woken up from a bad nightmare and ended up staying till morning. The boat ended up being loaded with all the stuff from the lighthouse and it set sail, but the boat never made it to its destination. An accident caused it to sink.
Next on our list today we have the Kinnaird Head Castle Lighthouse, located in Fraserburgh, Scotland. The story goes that the owner of the castle, Alexander Fraser, Laird of Philorth, I think that's how you pronounce that. Anyways, he had a daughter, Isabel, who fell in love with a servant, Piper. Much like Romeo and Juliet, Fraser forbade the affair, but as we know, young women rarely listen to their father's opinions on suitors, and so they did whatever they could to be together. But one day Fraser had enough of the pair sneaking around behind his back, and so he tied the Piper to Seal's Hole, a cavern located underneath the wine tower located next to the castle lighthouse. He then locked his daughter in the wine tower's top floor. That night, a high tide hit the shores surrounding the tower and the piper drowned. When Isabel found out about her lover's death, she flung herself out of the window. Her ghost can now be seen wandering around the grounds surrounding the lighthouse, usually during high tide and bad weather. And if you listen hard enough, it is said that you can also hear the sounds of pipes being played by the poor piper.
Boon Island Lighthouse is said to be haunted by a ghost in a flowing white gown, the spirit of Kathleen Bright. In the 1800s, Kathleen married the lighthouse keeper and moved to Boon Island full of hope. One version of the story tells of her husband falling ill during a storm and passing away, leaving Kathleen to tend to the lighthouse alone, and for days she climbed the stairs tirelessly, not having eaten or slept until the light finally went out. Locals rushed to the island to check on things and found Kathleen wandering the lighthouse aimlessly, completely grief-stricken, and died not long after. Another version of the tale goes that the husband drowned, and Kathleen ended up dragging his body all the way back to the lighthouse and then tended to the light for days without rest until locals found her sitting beside her husband's lifeless body. Once again, she died soon after being found. And ever since her death, fishermen have reported spotting the ghostly figure of Kathleen wandering the island, along with eerie wails echoing from the lighthouse. Two later lighthouse keepers even reported the light mysteriously turning on when they were both outside. They were the only ones on the island. At least the only living on the island.
Next up, we have the Pensacola Lighthouse, one of the most haunted lighthouses in the world, according to the Travel Channel. Which makes sense considering the fact that it has been haunted for the past 160 years. The lighthouse was built in 1824. After it was built, the Clifford family moved in, and a few years later, their adult daughter passed away during a delivery in room 1911, which has now come to be known as the Bloody Room. In the 1840s, Michaela Penelber moved in with her husband, but he died shortly after, and so she hired two men to help around the property until her death. During the Civil War, opposing sides fought over the property, damaging it severely. During its reconstruction, which took a total of 23 years, lightning struck the tower twice in the same year, and an earthquake struck the grounds as well, just to add insult to injury. Also during the reconstruction period, a man named Samuel Lawrence died while working as a lighthouse keeper. He is now often seen peering out the windows. The basement is also said to be haunted by two former workers who died on the property. In total, the property is said to be haunted by 6 spirits, some kind, some not, and some a bit handsy.
The Souter Lighthouse in England has been standing tall since 1871. It's gained quite the reputation over the years, being known as one of the most haunted lighthouses in the UK. Legend goes that Isabella Darling, niece of the renowned heroine Grace Darling, is said to wander the lighthouse to this day. Staff have reported your standard ghostly activity, random drops in temperature, phantom footsteps, but some have even claimed to have seen things like spoons floating in the air, and visitors will sometimes say they hear their own names being called before witnessing the apparition of a young girl believed to be Isabella, along with the sound of sobbing. And unseen hands will often tug at people's clothing or hair. Another tale tells of a lighthouse waitress encountering a ghostly figure in a keeper's uniform that then vanished into thin air, leaving behind this scent of tobacco.
Next up, we've got the New London Ledge Lighthouse, located in Newport, Rhode Island. This is definitely one of my personal favorite lighthouses just because it's completely surrounded by water. That being said, depending on who you are, there's a good chance this is the scariest lighthouse to you because of the fact that it's completely surrounded by water, meaning no chance of escape from the ghosts and ghouls that inhabit the property. The lighthouse was built in 1909. Sometime between then and the 80s, a man named Ernie became employed as a lighthouse keeper. After Ernie's death, his job was given to the coast's guardsmen, who often complained about experiencing strange occurrences during their time in the lighthouse. Weird noises, slamming doors, faulty electronics, and having their blankets pulled off of their beds in the middle of the night was not uncommon.
Heceta Head Lighthouse in Oregon is said to be full of paranormal activity. One story is about the ghost of a woman known as the Gray Lady, the restless spirit of a mother whose infant daughter tragically fell to her death from the cliff below the lighthouse. It said the Gray Lady haunts the attic of this place now. Workers have said they've seen a woman in a long gray skirt floating around up there. One worker was tasked with replacing a broken window in the attic and was working away when suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her floating by. He fled the attic, and when he came back the next day, he found that the broken glass from the window he was fixing was neatly swept and piled by the window. At least it's a cleanly ghost. Visitors will also say, though, they see flickering lights, doors mysteriously locking by themselves, and items disappearing from one room and then showing up in a completely different one.
And finally, we have the South Stack or Anglesey Lighthouse, located just northwest of Holyhead on Holly Island in Wales. For centuries, the island has been the center of tales about dragons, fairies, and other mythical and mystical creatures. The lighthouse itself was built in 1809 to warn ships of poor weather and rough waters, but in 1853, despite those warnings, a dozen ships still went down along the shores of the Anglesey coast and the shores of the island after a massive storm rolled in. The original lighthouse keeper Jack Jones is also said to have died in the same storm after being hit by a falling rock during the rough weather. Today, Jack's ghost is said to haunt the castle, pounding on the windows and doors, perhaps trying to get the attention of boats passing by so that they may not meet the same fate as those in the dozen sunken ships.
I kind of want to get a job working in a lighthouse. It's always been this kind of cool idea, you know, a bit of a romanticism to it.
Are you feeling enlightened, you guys?
Good question.
Let us know
in the comments. I've been your host, James.
I've been your host, Hannah.
We'll catch you out there on the sea, folks.
Yes, we will.